History of the American Folk Music Revival Part 3. The Revival at its Height. The Kingston Trio, a group originating on the West Coast, were directly inspired by the Weavers in their style and presentation and covered some of the Weavers' material, which was predominantly traditional. The Kingston Trio avoided overtly political or protest songs and cultivated a clean-cut collegiate persona. They were discovered while playing at a college club called the Cracked Pot by Frank Werber, who became their manager and secured them a deal with Capitol Records. Their first hit was a rewritten rendition of an old-time folk murder ballad, Tom Dooley, which had been sung at Lead Belly's funeral concert. This went gold in 1958 and sold more than 3 million copies. The success of the album and the single earned the Kingston Trio a Grammy Award for Best Country and Western Performance at the awards' inaugural ceremony in 1959. At the time, no folk music category existed in the Grammys scheme. The next year, largely as a result of the Kingston Trio album and Tom Dooley, the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences instituted a folk category, and the trio won the first Grammy Award for Best Ethnic or Traditional Folk Recording for its second studio album at large. At one point, the Kingston Trio had 4 records at the same time among the top 10 selling albums for 5 consecutive weeks in November and December 1959 according to Billboard magazine's Top LPs chart, a record unmatched for more than 50 years and noted at the time by a cover story in Life magazine. The huge commercial success of the Kingston Trio, whose recordings between 1958 and 1961 earned more than $25 million for Capitol Records, or about $220 million in 2021 dollars, spawned a host of groups that were similar in some respects, like the Brothers Four, Peter, Paul and Mary, the Limeliters, the Chad Mitchell Trio, the new Christy Minstrels, and more. As noted by critic Bruce Eder in the All Music Guide, the popularity of the commercialized version of folk music represented by these groups emboldened record companies to sign, record, and promote artists with more traditionalist and political sensibilities. The Kingston Trio's popularity would be followed by that of Joan Baez, whose debut album Joan Baez reached the top 10 in late 1960 and remained on the Billboard charts for over 2 years. Baez's early albums contained mostly traditional material, such as the Scottish ballad, Mary Hamilton, as well as many covers of melancholy tunes that had appeared in Harry Smith's anthology of American folk music, such as The Wagoner's Lad and The Butcher Boy. She did not try to imitate the singing style of her source material, however, but used a rich soprano with vibrato. Her popularity, and that of the folk revival itself, would place Baez on the cover of Time magazine in November 1962. Unlike the Kingston Trio, Baez was openly political, and as the civil rights movement gathered steam, she aligned herself with Pete Seeger, Guthrie, and others. Baez was one of the singers with Seeger, Josh White, Peter, Paul and Mary, and Bob Dylan, who appeared at Martin Luther King's 1963 March on Washington and sang, "We Shall Overcome," a song that had been introduced by People's Songs. Harry Belafonte was also present on that occasion, as was Odetta, whom Martin Luther King introduced as the Queen of Folk Music, when she sang, "Oh Freedom." Odetta Sings Folk Songs was one of 1963's best-selling folk albums. Also on hand were the SNCC Freedom Singers, the personnel of which went on to form Sweet Honey in the Rock. The critical role played by Freedom Songs in the voter registration drives, Freedom Rides, and lunch counter sit-ins during the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and early 60s in the South gave folk music tremendous new visibility and prestige. The peace movement was likewise energized by the rise of the campaign for nuclear disarmament in the UK, protesting the British testing of the H-bomb in 1958, as well as by the ever-proliferating arms race and the increasingly unpopular Vietnam War. Young singer-songwriter Bob Dylan, playing acoustic guitar and harmonica, had been signed and recorded for Columbia by producer John Hammond in 1961. Dylan's record enjoyed some popularity among Greenwich Village folk music enthusiasts, but he was discovered by an immensely larger audience when Peter, Paul, and Mary had a hit with a cover of his song, Blowin' in the Wind. That trio also brought Pete Seegers and the Weavers' If I Had a Hammer to nationwide audiences, as well as covering songs by other artists such as Dylan and John Denver. It was not long before the folk music category came to include less traditional material and more personal and poetic creations by individual performers, who called themselves singer-songwriters. As a result of the financial success of high-profile commercial folk artists, record companies began to produce and distribute records by a new generation of folk revival and singer-songwriters: phil-ochs, Tom Paxton, Eric Vaughan Schmidt, Buffy St. Marie, Dave Van Ronk, Judy Collins, Tom Rush, Fred Neil, Gordon Lightfoot, Billy Edwheeler, John Denver, John Stewart, Arlo Guthrie, Harry Chapin, and John Hartford, among others. Some of this wave had emerged from family singing and playing traditions, and some had not. These singers frequently prided themselves on performing traditional material in imitations of the style of the source singers whom they had discovered, frequently by listening to Harry Smith's celebrated LP compilation of forgotten or obscure commercials 78 RPM, Race, and Hillbilly, recordings of the 1920s and 30s, the Folkways Anthology of American Folk Music, 1951. A number of the artists who had made these old recordings were still very much alive and had been rediscovered and brought to the 1963 and 64 Newport folk festivals. For example, traditionalist Clarence Ashley introduced folk revivalists to the music of friends of his who still actively played the older music, such as Doc Watson and the Stanley Brothers.